Hello and welcome back. Today we'll be discussing the legendary tale of Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver's Travels was written by Jonathan Swift, an Anglo-Irish author, in 1726. This satirical fantasy novel intertwines the themes of perspective, moral versus physical power, and deception.
The novel begins with the life of Lemuel Gulliver, a boy grown into a rich family. Through schooling and apprenticeship, he has become a well-known surgeon in England. He has boarded many ships with the duty of a surgeon. On his said last trip, he plans to be at sea for 6 years on a ship called the Antelope. While working on the ship, a sudden storm wrecks it completely, leaving Gulliver as the only survivor, stranded on a mysterious island. He soon falls asleep of exhaustion. Once awake, he finds himself tied down and completely incapable of moving. He finds himself surrounded by 6-inch men called Lilliputians. Gulliver begins to struggle, and these men shoot arrows at him. As he lays there, the little men begin to loosen his strings and bring him food and drink on command. Gulliver is tempted to pick up handfuls of these men and crush them to death, but suddenly realizes that he needs to be submissive and obedient to earn their trust. This scene introduces the theme of moral versus physical power. As Gulliver sleeps at night, the Lilliputians place him upon a carriage and carry him into town to meet the Emperor. Upon arrival, everyone is dumbfounded by his size.
Gulliver is only allowed in a small room connected to the wall by a chain. He realizes he is in need to relieve himself, so he pees on the floor. This scene introduces the symbol of excrement and Gulliver's dedication to honesty. The Lilliputians are delighted by Gulliver's gentleness and begin to supply him with handmade clothes and luxury items such as food. Gulliver begs the Emperor for his liberty, and he complies. Gulliver then pleads for even more freedom, which the Emperor again agrees to under a few rules. Gulliver is not allowed to leave the kingdom without permission. He will not trample the field of Lilliput or the Lilliputians. He will act as the messenger for the Lilliputians, and that he will act as an ally against their enemies and survey the circumference of the island.
Gulliver learns that the people of Lilliput have a major problem. There is an impending invasion of Blefuscu, the other great empire in the universe. Gulliver forms a plan to swim across the channel to Blefuscu, tie their military fleet with a cable, and drag them back to Lilliput. To their surprise, it works. Gulliver begins to hear rumors about him forming an alliance with the Blefuscudians, and that they are mistaking his kindness for something else. One night, there is a fire in the palace caused by a lazy maid. They all turn to Gulliver for help, and Gulliver, having nothing to put it out with, urinates on the entire castle. Although he saved the palace, he feels deep regret. The symbol of excrement reoccurs. Gulliver gets an invitation to visit Blefuscu, and as he prepares for the trip, he gets a visit one night from a mystery man. He tells him that the Lilliputian Council has been secretly planning to punish Gulliver for many committed crimes, such as treason and traitorously communicating with their enemies. They plan to starve him to death within 3 days. Gulliver immediately leaves, saying he has left for Blefuscu early.
Once at Blefuscu, he finds an abandoned ship and plans to use it to go back to England. He departs with a well-stocked boat, thanks to the Blefuscudians, and an English merchant ship takes him aboard. He finally returns back to England, reuniting with his wife and children. He spends 2 months with them and then buys them a new house, leaves them money, and then departs again so he can explore the world on a merchant ship called the Adventure.
Part 2 begins with the voyage of the Adventure. It starts smoothly, and then out of nowhere, a storm comes crashing down somewhere north of Madagascar and destroys the ship. They decide to disembark on an island to find some fresh water. As they begin to search, they run into giant monsters. The crew runs back and begins to row away without Gulliver. Gulliver then runs deeper into the island, realizing he is surrounded by giant grass and corn. Gulliver's perspective will be entirely different on the second voyage, considering his size. As he runs, he sees a group of these giant monsters holding swords. He compares himself to the Lilliputians now that he is minuscule. Everything is dependent on comparison. When one of the monsters nearly steps on him, he picks Gulliver up as if he is a foreign animal. The monster gently places him in his pocket and brings him into the farmer's market.
Once with the farmer's family, they supply him with a great lunch. Gulliver is tormented by the sun, terrified by the cat, nearly squeezed to death by the baby, and horrified by the wife's face. That night, the wife puts Gulliver to bed, and before long he is attacked by 2 large rats the size of mastiffs. He kills one with his sword and scares the other one away. The farmer's daughter, Glumdalclitch, takes good care of Gulliver, washing and making new clothes for him. News of Gulliver spreads around the town, and the farmer's neighbor suggests that he make some money out of Gulliver. At a town market, the king places Gulliver upon a table and forces him to answer Glumdalclitch's questions. This show is a success, and the farmer takes him on a countrywide tour, scheduling almost 10 shows a day. Gulliver, on the edge of death and starving, isn't performing to the farmer's expectations. He then sells Gulliver to the queen along with his daughter. The queen is very impressed with Gulliver's knowledge, and the king believes he is a piece of clockwork. The king orders philosophers to examine Gulliver and determine what he is and where he came from. He is not believing Gulliver's words. They are truly puzzled and conclude that he is a freak of nature. Gulliver describes that his biggest pest throughout the day is the queen's dwarf. He likes to torment, abuse, and humiliate Gulliver.
With Gulliver's great geographical knowledge, he describes the island of Brobdingnag as a rocky peninsula between Japan and northwest America. Gulliver enjoys leaving the island to explore with Glumdalclitch. She has made a special box to carry him around when they travel. Gulliver recounts some of the traumatizing events that have happened to him due to his size. He was nearly struck to death by apples when the dwarf shaked the tree at him, almost crushed by hail, eaten by a dog, and pecked by birds who steal his food. His most dangerous encounter was when a monkey thought he was a baby monkey, so he stole him from the castle and began to force feed him. After spending 2 years in Brobdingnag, Gulliver leaves by accident. On a trip to the ocean, a guard who was supposed to be watching the box that Gulliver was in got distracted. During this time, Gulliver was swooped up by a giant bird. He is carried for a while and then eventually dropped into the water. Eventually, he feels himself being lifted, and to his surprise, he was surrounded by a bunch of Englishmen. The nurse on the ship replenishes him, and then Gulliver asks if anyone has seen a giant bird. They all reply with no's, quite dumbfounded. Gulliver finally makes it back to England and goes to see his family. Although his wife begs him to stay home, Gulliver leaves once again.
Ignoring the anger of his wife, Gulliver accepts an invitation to work as a surgeon of a ship called Hopewell. After a few weeks of smooth sailing, the ship is hijacked by pirates, most of which are Japanese. Gulliver persuades the pirates to set him free on a small canoe with only 4 days' worth of food. The rest of the crew's men are taken captive. Once abandoned, he rows to an island where he finds eggs to eat and a cave to sleep in. As Gulliver awakes, he sees an opaque body float across the sun and down towards the island. The image moves closer and closer, and Gulliver begins to beg for help. The opaque image doesn't speak English but understands that he needs help. Gulliver is soon surrounded by a group of strange-looking individuals. Some have their heads down and others are cross-eyed. Gulliver learns that this island is called Laputa and is soon led to the king. Once he arrives, the king is too occupied with a complex math problem to even notice Gulliver for a whole hour. He then demands that Gulliver get something to eat. The food brought to him are all cut into geometric shapes. After dinner, a tutor comes to teach him their language, and he learns that Laputa comes from the etymology meaning of High Governor. After a few hours, the Laputan king orders Laputa to be steered towards Legato. Gulliver describes that the Laputians rely on mathematical terms for speaking and that they must live in houses with no right angles. They cannot comprehend common sense or practical knowledge.
Gulliver asks for permission to visit the island of Legato, and he is granted it. He describes it as a 4-mile diameter circle with a base of magnetic lodestone in the center. He learns that Laputa's movements are controlled by astronomers who turn the magnet in whatever way the king wants to face. The king manipulates the kingdom below with the movements. If they are misbehaving, he will turn the island so that they will not get any sunlight. He can also pelt them with stones and threaten to smash them with the island of Laputa. Gulliver is not a fan of his time at Laputa and requests for permission to visit Legato. He is granted this request, and once there, he meets a man named Munondi, who tells him the story of the two islands. He tells him of all the amazing professors and academies that are on this island. The next day, Gulliver sets out to see these different academies. He encounters men called projectors who are working on many strange projects, such as extracting sunbeams from cucumbers and building houses from top down. He then goes to visit the political professors and learns that if there is a political debate, surgeons will do surgery on each of their brains and swap pieces so that they can come to a consensus.
Gulliver leaves Legato and sets out for Lugnag between America and Japan. When he finds out that there are no ships going to Lugnag, he joins a ship filled with men practicing necromancy on their way to Glub-Dub-Dribbian. All of the men on the ship are ghosts, which startles Gulliver at first, but he soon gets used to it. The ghosts on the ship bring him to Glub-Dub-Dribbian and reincarnate famous men upon Gulliver's request. After only a few short days on the island, Gulliver sets out for Lugnag. At Lugnag, he meets many immortals. He befriends them and asks to live on Lugnag forever as an immortal. They laugh at him and tell him there is more to being an immortal than meets the eye. Though the king wishes for him to stay longer, Gulliver insists that he must get home. He finally returns back to England to see his family in the first time in 5 years.
After Gulliver spends 5 months in England, long enough to impregnate his wife, he sets out again on the adventure. Along the way, several men die on the ship, so he decides to hire new crewsmen. To his surprise, the men that he hired are all pirates who imprison Gulliver and soon abandons him on a remote island. He begins to walk around on the island and notices these ugly animals. Suddenly, they all run away, being frightened by a horse. The horse seems slightly repulsed by the sight of Gulliver, and another one comes up, and they begin to discuss. Listening to them speak, Gulliver hears the word Yahoo many times. Swift again shows Gulliver's perspective by only describing the scene with the knowledge he has. The horses lead Gulliver to a house where he expects to see a group of humans, but to his astonishment, he walks into a party of horses. Gulliver observes the power dynamics between the horses and realizes the gray one is the highest class.
One night, as Gulliver begins to undress, a horse walks in on him, seeing his naked body. Since Gulliver's clothes were the only thing separating him from the Yahoos, the Master Horse asks him to explain himself. He calls Gulliver a Master Yahoo, although he wishes to not be any sort of Yahoo. Gulliver summarizes some of the discussions he has with the horses and how they don't understand his English lifestyle. The gray horse continues to use the word Yahoo and leads Gulliver to the backyard to see the ugly animals. Once Gulliver takes a closer look, he sees that they are not animals but that they are humans. These are the Yahoos, and if Gulliver was not wearing clothes, he would also be a Yahoo. The horses treat him with respect and help him learn their language. The horses ask about the origin of which Gulliver came from and are shocked when they find out that it is a society completely run by Yahoos.
As Gulliver delves deeper and deeper into this lifestyle, he begins to resent the portrait of humankind. His time with the horses have opened his eyes to the evils of human nature and wishes to live permanently with the horses and never return back to England. He notices his shift in perspective that only can be developed through the new environment. Gulliver often goes out to study the Yahoos to learn more about human nature. When observing, the Yahoos come up to him, almost monkey-like with their movements and speech. He explains that among the horses, the Yahoos are kept in kennels and are ordered to do field work. Gulliver has never felt happier than when living with the master horse. He has his own room and pillows made of Yahoo hair. Although he wasn't quite fond of the horses in the beginning, he now admires them. Now, when he sees his own reflection in the water, he is disgusted. One day, the master horse tells Gulliver that he cannot live on this island anymore and that it is best if he returns home. Gulliver is so upset by this news that he faints. Once conscious, he builds a canoe out of Yahoo skin and sails away.
When he is out sailing, he thinks to himself that he would rather live on a vacant island than go back to a society run by Yahoos. He finds an island that he thinks is uninhabited and soon gets run out by savages. Out at sea again, Gulliver runs into a Portuguese ship and they gladly take him aboard. They all make fun of him for his story, which causes him to jump off the side of the ship, attempting to kill himself. One of the men saves him and takes care of him. The man brings him to his house in England, but soon convinces him to go home. Once home, he finds that his family is presumed dead. He ends the story with his explanation as to why he wrote the novel and how it has impacted him. To conclude, Gulliver was an adventurous man with multiple identity crises as seen through his experiences with the Lilliputians, Brobdingnag, Laputa, and with the horses.